Welcome to today's online dialogue hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's TrailNation Collaborative. I'm Mary Ellen Kuntz. I lead the collaborative here at RTC, and I'm your host today alongside my esteemed colleague, Kevin Mills, RTC's Vice President of Policy, and Gary Toth, a longtime expert on all of the work that we'll be talking about today. Today's topic is overcoming barriers, innovative practices for securing federal funding. Today's conversation will give us an opportunity to explore barriers to accessing federal funding for trail and active transportation networks. Participants today are going to hear about how others in the Trails movement have found solutions to common challenges and have the chance to engage directly with each other and your peers through breakout rooms on barriers and strategies to make the most of current federal funding opportunities. If you're not aware, we are in the middle of the bipartisan infrastructure law and all of the funding that provides. So we'll be going really deep into some of those. We are hoping that by the end of today's session, you have not only learned something new, but you've also made a connection with a fellow practitioner and had the opportunity to grow your own network. The TrailNation Collaborative is a nationwide peer learning community that brings together leaders, advocates, and professionals from across disciplines to work together to establish and advance connected trail and active transportation networks all across the country. To date, we have over 7,000 people signed up for the collaborative. The collaborative provides proven tools, methods, and resources, including the TrailNation Playbook. Combined with RTC's expertise from our TrailNation projects and beyond, as well as that of you, our network of partners across the country, we come together to find solutions to common challenges and barriers, working to accelerate the development of these connected trail systems. This opportunity is free and open to all. We welcome professionals and advocates in the trail and active transportation community, as well as the many adjacent fields that trails touch. This year, a primary focus for the collaborative is on the implementation of federal funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BILL. It's also known as IIJA sometimes. This is the through line for this conversation and all of our upcoming webinars and dialogues throughout the year, to encourage and assist communities to take advantage of this once-in-a-generation funding for trails and active transportation. Before we get started, let's review the structure of today's session, as it is a little bit different than our traditional webinars. The session, as you've noticed, is in a Zoom meeting form. It's an hour-long session with 2 short presentations from both Kevin and from Gary. And then following that, we'll move into breakout rooms where folks can connect with your peers and discuss shared innovations, ideas, and challenges. We'll have RTC staff there to help guide the conversation, but I'm really relying on all of you to meet with each other and collaborate. After that, we'll come back together for Q&A and a large group discussion at the end. We encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to interact with your colleagues and participate in the interactive event. As with all of our TrailNation Collaborative activities, we want to provide time for you to interact with each other. That means that the chat will also remain open and that attendees are encouraged to engage in the chat box both before and after the breakout sessions. While the chat is open and enabled, my colleagues on the call are filtering out questions from there, as well as the Q&A box for our large group discussion at the end. Please feel free to add those questions as we proceed through the session. If you have specific technical assistance questions for us, please follow up with an email after today's session so we can best address you. To make this easier, please update your name on Zoom to include your name, the state you reside in, and your organization affiliation. You can see how mine is formatted at the bottom of my video. We encourage folks to keep their cameras on today so that we can all see each other, but please do stay muted until we move into the breakout groups. We are recording today's session for our own notes and will be publishing only a recording of the presentation portion of today. As I noted earlier, we have a number of RTC staff on the call who will also be in breakout rooms, mostly listening and taking notes. We hope that this allows everyone to speak more freely and openly in breakouts and the large group discussion portion as we work together to address these shared challenges. At the end of today's session, you will be prompted to take a short survey and we appreciate it if you take just a few moments to share your thoughts and feedback. We really do use this to guide future sessions, and that is so valuable. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to guide the rest of today's session. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. So what I would like to do today is start us off by talking about what the habits are of highly successful communities. So we'll take the next slide for that. So, let's first say that since this webinar is about barriers, let me get bridge to those habits of highly successful communities by talking about some of the barriers that we have heard our friends encounter over the years. And one is that you need match funds often to receive a federal grant, and that can be a challenge. Another that we often hear as a concern is about meeting environmental requirements. And another is about getting projects into the plans that make them eligible for those federal resources. So with that, let me pivot to talking about this from the positive end of what the kinds of communities that have been getting grants repeatedly, what is it that they do to have that success? So essentially the question is what works to repeatedly secure federal grants? And one thing I'll just say for context here at the outset is that federal transportation money, some of it is allocated directly from the U.S. Department of Transportation, some from the Federal Highway Administration, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as some, and most actually, cascade down to the states. So some are allocated by state departments of transportation, as well as some by the urbanized regional planning commissions called metropolitan planning organizations. So all of those different decision makers do allocate different pieces of federal resources. And so all of those are relevant to our conversation today. So the first habit of highly successful communities that I want to highlight is that they tend to have a network vision. They've thought about, we have a North Star about what we want to accomplish. What would it look like to be successful? And this guides plans, it helps in setting priorities, and it drives political will. It inspires people to say, oh, I get what you're trying to do. I get why that would be transformative for our community. And so that's the first habit I want to draw attention to. The second is that there's a project pipeline. That is, different infrastructure projects have different steps. You have to plan, you have to design, sometimes there's acquisition of corridors. There's, of course, construction, and a thoughtful plan will basically recognize that that's a pipeline that's maintained over time. You pull things through, get them done, but other things are coming through and maturing and getting ready to get built. And so it's really important to kind of have a intention about that project pipeline. The next slide, please. The third habit I want to highlight is it pays to document costs and benefits. And I don't mean this only in the sense of a formal cost benefit analysis, although some programs really call for doing that. I'm thinking of this both formally and informally as a tool of persuasion. You need to know your audience, that decision maker, and have a sense of what's the value of this project? What's the return on investment? Why would they want to do this over something else? Because it's always a matter of relative priorities. Fourth, you want to make an effort to correlate your needs, your funding needs, to the various different funding programs. And so that's a little bit of an effort to research and understand the eligibilities of different programs, the requirements of different programs, the timing of when the calls for proposals come out, and how that overlays with the progression of your projects through that project pipeline we noted. And also it sometimes it involves knowing when is there an investment that might be so small that you don't want to bother with federal funds for that one. So because there's a rule that the first federal dollar spent on a project federalizes it and brings in all of the different federal requirements. And so some places will say, well, these little small things we need to do, we'll pay for those with other funds. We're going to focus on a little bit bigger fish to fry when we're looking for federal grants. Next slide, please. And my final item I want to bring up in terms of habits is having the foresight to anticipate the steps you need to be eligible and competitive. So there'll be three things I note here, and note this brings us full circle back to those barriers I noted at the beginning, right? One is that to get federal dollars, you need to be in transportation plans. And so specifically, there's something called the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program for your region, and then the STIP, the State Transportation Improvement Program, which is kind of a roll-up of all those different regional plans into a state plan. And you need to be in those plans to receive federal dollars, and so that's something to be mindful of in advance. Second thing is match. So the general rule for federal transportation projects is that 80% of the money can be federal, but at least 20% of the money needs to be state or local. Now, there are exceptions for that. And so you want to look to see if the exceptions apply to you. So for instance, in the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, we've included an exception for low-income communities where it can be 100% federally funded project. There's also some provisions like that in certain safety programs and so on. So you want to be mindful of those opportunities. Then the other thing is, and this definitely takes foresight, is some states will have policies where the state is providing funding that means, because the match is state or local, right? So it's not always on the local community. And some states have been very intentional about having pots of money that will help locals leverage those federal funds and bring more funds to their state. So, one example is Florida uses toll revenue to help certain communities meet their match. California does it in a more broadly universal kind of way, and so on. So that's an opportunity. And then the one that really often trips people up are what we call the federal requirements. And this mostly refers to environmental and labor requirements. So for the environment, there's concerns often about the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and its requirement for environmental impact statements or environmental assessments. But I have good news for you, which is that normally your bicycle and pedestrian projects should be subject to something called a categorical exclusion. So this is basically a finding. There's a finding from the Federal Highway Administration that that bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure projects, generally speaking, do not have significant environmental impacts. And therefore, that they meet this criteria, so that they should normally not need NEPA approvals from Federal Highway Administration. Now, there could be scrutiny to a project if it has some controversial environmental, specific project has controversial environmental elements, or it has impact on a historic site of national significance, and there's a list of those things. But what it does is essentially sets a default. Hey, bicycle and pedestrian projects are good for the environment, not bad, right? And so, we want to make it easier to do those. And so one of the reasons why our local friends often get tripped up by the environmental requirements is sometimes the Federal Highway Administration regional offices are not consistent about applying this categorical exclusion to their projects. And so you really want to keep an eye out for that and say, hey, wait, and we're going to put it in the chat. I've got the citation for you from the Code of Federal Regulations that points out this Federal Highway Administration finding. So what you want to do is cite that so that they know that you really should be getting one of these exclusions. I'll end with labor requirements. So there's a law called Davis-Bacon, and it's about paying prevailing wages for infrastructure projects that use federal funds. On the Department of Labor website, there's some good guidance for how to determine the wage if you are subject to it. But what I want to bring up to is that this law does apply to transportation alternatives and surface transportation block grant projects. However, recreational trail projects that are not in the highway right-of-way are excluded from being treated as projects on the federal aid highway system. And so they can use just state procedures. So, and I will also note that I have confirmation from the Federal Highway Administration that their current transportation alternatives guidance is outdated on this question. And so, they're saying this is in fact the current rule, and we're going to update what you see on our website soon. So that's the good news. And with that, I believe we're ready to turn to Gary.
Thanks, Kevin. As Kevin pointed out, federal funds can be channeled to your your community or your organization in two ways. One is directly via the various IIJA notice of funding opportunities that are now bombarding us, actually. And the second way is channeled through traditional state DOT programs, usually called local aid programs. Either way, the state DOTs are important players. Obviously more important on the second way when they get channeled through state DOTs. So Kevin asked me to talk a little bit about understanding DOTs. Now I could talk about this for a day and a half, right? Because it's not a simple answer. But basically, next slide, please. This has evolved over the years. The pre-automobile era, there were no state DOTs and there were no separate transportation agencies in general. And so, and street design was and engineers worked side by side with community planners, and it had to accommodate all users. There was no question about, particularly before the car, about accommodating pedestrians, bicyclists, and all sorts of other non-vehicular transportation. And the relationship of land use to streets was critical to survival. Next slide. Then we fell in love with the automobile. Next slide. And that changed everything. People actually, people think I'm simply defending DOTs, but people became enamored with the car. Communities used to have parades where everybody would come out with their cars and so on. And we all stopped viewing streets as places. Next slide. And of course, with the accessibility provided by the car, we became obsessed with higher and higher speeds. So, next slide. The transportation industry reinvented itself. All of a sudden, it had to become more specialized. And this was accelerated by the Interstate Act in 1951, and everybody state DOTs became primarily concerned with building bigger roads. That was until 1991 with this landmark legislation called the Intermodal Surface Transportation Act of 1991, basically nicknamed ICE-T. Everybody calls it ICE-T now. And that first required separate pockets of money put aside for non-motorized transportation. And the DOTs reluctantly did that. And I can tell you, I was in New Jersey DOT at that time, and boy, were we trying to find ways to twist some of these categories into simply putting more pavement on our roadways. Next slide, please. Policies were changed, but those of you who have ever worked in a government bureaucracy can understand that the practice was slow to follow. And so there was all sorts of ways to stymie this. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. But as Kevin pointed out, opportunities are there if you work at it. Next slide. So state DOTs, it's been 33 years now since ICE-T, and most state DOTs have given up. And whatever the allocation, I think now, Kevin can answer this more directly because I haven't worked for a state DOT in a while, but there's a certain percentage of funds that need to be allocated to non-motorized transportation, walking, biking, trails, and so on. The state DOTs have set aside staff and created programs to help you access the federal formula funds. Because even though it may not be the original core mission of state DOTs going back 30 or 40 years, the fact of the matter is that no state DOT wants to be responsible for leaving federal money on the table. So they've set up some infrastructure to do it. And the way you find so I would encourage you to, whatever the name of your state is, type in Minnesota State DOT local aid programs, and something will come up on your browser, and it'll usually identify the staff and the programs. Similarly, they have created community involvement programs to help you with all levels of working with the state DOT. And they also could be a place for you to go ahead and look for some help. And a lot of times, the community involvement staff is some of the community relations. It's your first portal into a DOT. Next slide. MPOs, which Kevin pointed out, in urban areas, every urbanized area over 50,000 has a metropolitan planning organization, and they can also be very helpful. They have boards, they have technical staff that you can talk to, and they're very approachable, and they even create committees. And if you want to do some of your homework, and as Kevin was pointing out, you could try to get on a committee and figure out how you could get involved with an MPO. And that's important because increasingly over the last 5 years, some money is actually set aside now to be dispensed directly by the metropolitan planning organizations. And I know, for instance, I'm working with the city of Trenton in New Jersey, and there's $3 or $4 or $5 million a year that are set aside directly by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission for the Trenton urbanized area. Next slide. So if you're not in an urbanized area, there are many rural planning organizations. They're not as structured. They're not specified. Their format is not specified by federal law. So there's all sizes and shapes of them, but all of them will have some staff that you can consult if you're fortunate enough to have one for your region that you consult with that'll help you along with it. And the URL down at the bottom there is a way to find out who they are. Next slide. So a few specific points, and it kind of covers what Kevin was covering. Read and understand the notice of funding opportunity. They call them NOFOs, right? And that may sound obvious, but believe me, I know they're hard to read. They're usually 70 pages and they're duplicative, and you can get a headache. And you keep your bottle of Advil alongside as you go through it because it's tough to read. But read it and understand, and they'll specify what the funding is for, because not all these programs are the same. Understand the value of the project to your community and sell that to the funding agency. And so a lot of times, I mean, in my town where I live, squeaky wheel a lot of times will get the mayor to push to apply for something. But you should develop a right discussion with the many community members of what this project is going to mean for your community, and sell that in your application. But then also, as you look at the NOFO, they have a lot of federal grant criteria, and don't just pay lip service to them. They're calling for equity, they're calling for multimodal, sustainability, environmental issues. And so, don't think, believe me, this is a specific example that I've dealt with in the last 6 months. Don't think that adding a 3-foot bike lane to a 4-lane road will convince USDOT that you're serious about getting folks off your roads. Last slide. If you have any issues trying to find out what is a legitimate bike or pedestrian project or street design or whatever, here's 2 guides covering rural areas and urban areas. And again, the URLs are there. I presume you guys will have access to these slides later, but these are fantastic guides in terms of what should be in a multimodal project.
Hi folks, it's Mary Ellen again. I learned so much from these conversations and really appreciate having Gary and Kevin on to join us today.